The city was too quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that settles in the middle of the night or just before a storm. This was different. Something out of place. The streets were empty, as if time had stopped. The shop windows remained unchanged. The same newspaper stacked outside a small kiosk, dated 3 days ago. The neon sign of the gas station flickered weakly, but there was no one there to notice. And then, there was the mirror. In the center of the square, an old, dust-covered frame held a massive mirror, cracked with age. At first, it seemed like just another forgotten object, abandoned like the rest of the town. But soon, they realized something was wrong. Fred, Daphne, Velma, and Shaggy saw their reflections. Scooby did not. Velma frowned and stepped forward, adjusting her glasses. Shaggy felt a shiver crawl up his spine and instinctively stepped back. "Wait a second," Velma murmured. She looked at Scooby, who stood beside her, ears perked up and tail still. But in the mirror, nothing. No outline, no shadow, just emptiness. Guys? What kind of haunted house is this?" Shaggy's voice trembled. Daphne hesitantly reached out, touching the surface of the mirror. Cold. Too cold. Fred clenched his jaw, his blue eyes fixed on the aged frame. "Maybe it's just an illusion, a trick." Velma shook her head. "Mirrors don't work like that, Fred." The air around them grew colder. The sky above, once a dull gray, seemed wrong, like a painted backdrop on a canvas. And then, in the distance, something happened. One of the buildings on the street trembled for a moment. Then, it vanished, as if it had been erased. When it reappeared, something was different. The windows had changed shape. The bricks were a different color, like a mistake, a glitch in the world around them. Daphne took a step back, clenching her fists. "We need to get out of here." Velma's breathing quickened. "We need to understand what's happening. This town isn't real." Shaggy could barely form the words. "I think that's the problem, man. I think we never left." That's when they saw it. Movement, but not in the real world. Inside the mirror, the reflections were wrong. They weren't following them. Daphne turned her head, but her image remained still. Fred raised a hand, but his reflection didn't move. Shaggy smiled in the mirror. None of them were smiling. The silence became suffocating. Velma pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to organize her thoughts. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "We came here. We walked these streets. Her voice faded. Had they? She tried to remember the moment they arrived. The road, the trip, the exact moment they set foot in this town. Nothing. Like pages torn from a book. Daphne closed her eyes. Her voice, a hollow whisper. "We never arrived." Fred turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" Daphne swallowed hard. "Because we were already here." The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. And then, the mirror shattered. The entrance to Raven's Hollow was marked by an old, rusted sign, hanging precariously from a crooked wooden post. The faded letters were barely legible, as if time itself had tried to erase any trace of the place from the map. The road leading to town was narrow and riddled with potholes, flanked by tall, gnarled trees, whose bare branches seemed to stretch like skeletal fingers against the dark sky. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked asphalt. The silence was absolute. No rustling leaves, no croaking frogs, no sounds of life. There was no traffic, no distant chatter, not even the hum of nocturnal insects. Only the faint whisper of the wind and the creaking of old structures that seemed to groan under the weight of their own existence. The Mystery Machine's engine purred softly as its tires crunched over the loose gravel. Fred tightened his grip on the wheel, guiding the van slowly down the main street. The place felt frozen in time. Houses with boarded-up windows lined the road, still and abandoned, as though they had been forgotten long ago. A few shops remained open, but their dim lights flickered more like dying candles than signs of life. The few residents that remained were like shadows. They moved slowly inside the establishments, their faces partially obscured by the gloom. Even from a distance, it was clear they avoided eye contact, as if being seen might somehow attract something unwanted. Shaggy shrank into his seat. Like, this place gives me the creeps, man. Scooby whimpered softly, leaning closer to his friend, eyes wide. Outside, an old wooden sign swung in the wind, creaking unevenly. Daphne, watching through the window, frowned. It's like everyone here is afraid of something. Velma examined the map in her hands, her eyes scanning the empty streets. According to this, the mansion should be right at the end of this road. But before they could go any further, a figure appeared in the middle of the street. It was an old man worn down by time. His posture was hunched, as if he carried an invisible burden, and his clothes were tattered and filthy. His wide, wild eyes darted over them, as if they were some sort of omen. Fred hit the brakes, the van stopping just a few feet away from the man. The old man lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the darkness beyond the town. "Turn back, there's nothing for you there." The silence that followed his words was even more overwhelming. Fred exchanged glances with the others before lowering the window. "Sir, we're looking for the old man's. There is no mansion." The way he said it was like a blade of ice sinking into their spines. His voice was weak, but it carried a certainty so firm it felt like a verdict. It didn't sound like a warning. There was no plea in his tone, only the simple, terrible truth. Fred tried again. "But we..." Before he could finish, the old man abruptly turned away and began to walk off, muttering to himself. His words were unintelligible, but they carried an unsettling urgency. Velma adjusted her glasses, watching his frail silhouette vanish into the darkness. Well, that was disturbing. Shaggy crossed his arms, shivering. "Maybe that's our cue to leave before?" "We've come this far," Fred interrupted, firm. "We'll see it for ourselves." They pressed on. As they moved forward, the world behind them seemed to dissolve. The houses, the streets, the few dim lights that still flickered in the town, all disappeared into the darkness. It was as if the town itself refused to exist beyond that point. The air grew heavier. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the van. The trees around them thickened, their trunks casting grotesque shadows along the road. And then, as they rounded a bend, the mansion appeared. It was abrupt, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. A cold wind cut through the air, rustling the dry leaves and making the trees creak like they were whispering secrets. In the distance, thunder rumbled, echoing through the cloud-choked sky. Velma held her breath. There it is. The mansion loomed atop the hill, a dark monolith from another era. Its stone walls were smothered by dense, suffocating ivy. Its massive, empty windows stared down at them like vacant eyes, watching their every move. The iron gate, rusted and warped, swayed slightly in the wind, letting out a slow, mournful creak. Fred pushed the gate open. The scrape of metal against stone echoed in the silence. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Daphne crossed her arms, hugging herself. "I don't like this place." Fred climbed the cracked stone steps, the others hesitating just behind him. The mansion's door, massive and warped with age, was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal the darkness inside. Shaggy stopped on the first step, like maybe we should knock first. Velma ignored him and reached for the handle. Before she could push it open, the door swung inward on its own. A breath of cold air escaped from within, carrying the scent of dust, mold, and something else. Something metallic, something that smelled like rust but felt wrong. Like the faint, lingering scent of dried blood seeping into the walls. Fred looked at the others, his expression firm, masking his unease. "Well, here we go." They stepped inside. And then, with a deafening crash, the door slammed shut behind them. The silence that followed was absolute. The mansion had swallowed them whole. Darkness swallowed them the instant the door slammed shut. The only trace of light came from the faint glow of Daphne's phone screen and the unsteady beam of Velma's flashlight. The air inside the mansion was heavy, thick with the scent of aged wood, mold, and a faint metallic tang lingering in the background like rust or blood. The wind whistled through unseen cracks, and in the distance, the groaning of old wood echoed through the structure, as if the house itself were breathing. Fred turned immediately and pulled on the doorknob. Nothing. The door didn't budge an inch. Locked. Daphne swallowed hard. Maybe it was just the wind. Velma cut her off, her voice firm and tense. Number that door didn't just close. It was locked. Shaggy and Scooby instinctively shrank back, their eyes scanning the vast entrance hall. In the center, a grand staircase curved upward into shadows. Above them, an enormous chandelier hung from rusted chains, its glass covered in decades of dust, swaying slightly as if something had just passed by. And then they heard it. The first whisper. Low, distant, impossible to understand. Shaggy jumped back. Woo, who said that? Velma shook the flashlight against her palm, but the light remained unstable, illuminating only a small, trembling circle in front of them. Scooby sniffed the air, uneasy. His ears stood completely upright, his body stiff, and then, with a low whimper, he pressed himself against Shaggy. Daphne frowned as she felt her phone vibrate in her hand. That's weird. No signal, but I just got a message. Everyone gathered around as she lifted the screen. A single message flashed across it. You have been here before. A faint static noise crackled from the phone, like something trying to break through the line between the real and the impossible. Velma stood frozen. That doesn't make sense. Fred clenched his jaw, keeping his composure. We keep moving. They pressed forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, now coated in a fine layer of dust. The air grew even colder as they ventured deeper into the mansion. The hallway stretched on, its walls lined with ancient portraits of strangers. Their faces, frozen in vacant expressions, seemed to follow the group's every move. Shaggy let out a nervous laugh. Hey, I bet these paintings are just a trick of the light, right? As if waiting for that exact moment, one of the portraits blinked. A single wet blink of an eye. Dead silence. Shaggy screamed and stumbled backward, grabbing onto Daphne's arm. It moved. Scooby howled and hid behind Velma. Daphne stared at the painting, trying to see what Shaggy had seen. The image now looked perfectly normal, but something was wrong. Velma stepped closer, frowning. It must have been your imagination. There's no way. She stopped abruptly. Her flashlight illuminated the floor, and amidst the dust that had settled over years, something stood out. Footprints. Fresh ones. They weren't theirs. They led in the opposite direction, deeper into the mansion. Fred's fist clenched, his expression darkening. We're not alone. Above them, the sound of footsteps echoed, reverberating through the corridors. Scooby let out a low growl, his fur bristling. Velma cautiously followed the footprints. They led to a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The group approached. The room beyond appeared to be an old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty volumes, some scattered across the floor. Decayed furniture occupied the space, and the scent of mold was even stronger here. But in the center of the room, on a dark wooden desk, one object remained untouched. An old cassette recorder. The rewind button was pressed down. It was waiting to play. Fred hesitated. Should we listen? Velma, unable to tear her gaze away from the device, pressed play. A click, a low hiss of static. Then, a voice. If you are listening to this, run. You have been here before. But something doesn't want you to remember. The tape stopped. Absolute silence. Velma's heartbeat thundered in her chest. Then, every door in the mansion slammed shut at once. The sound exploded like thunder. Scooby howled. Shaggy clung to Daphne, shaking. Fred spun toward the door, but the corridor had changed. The paintings were gone. The walls, once worn with time, now looked pristine. No dust, no cracks. As if the house had rebuilt itself. In that very moment, Velma whispered, barely able to speak. It's changing. A new shadow emerged ahead. Tall, elongated, moving erratically, its form shifting, undefined. Its face was impossible to read. Time froze for a second. Fred didn't hesitate. Run! They bolted down the corridor, but the mansion twisted with every step. Doors appeared and vanished. Walls shifted like a living labyrinth. The floor beneath them groaned as if about to collapse. The air was thick, heavy, and the whispers were forming words. "Don't leave. Stay. You belong to us." The corridor's end was near, but there was no exit. The only way out was down. And then the floor gave way. They plunged into darkness, and the mansion swallowed them whole. The mansion shifted and twisted around them like a living entity, its very walls bending and contorting in impossible ways. The corridors stretched and contracted, distorting reality with each passing second. Footsteps echoed in the unnatural silence as they ran, their breath quick and shallow, panic thick in the air. The whispers had grown louder, overlapping voices calling their names, merging into an incomprehensible cacophony. Fred skidded to a halt as the hallway split into two paths. His eyes darted between them, searching for any sign of familiarity. "Which way?" he demanded, his voice taut with urgency. Daphne glanced at her phone, but the screen flickered with static, offering no help. "I don't know, these hallways weren't here before." Velma adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping the surroundings. The walls gleamed pristine and polished, completely different from the decayed and crumbling mansion they had first entered. It was as if the house were resetting itself. Shaggy swallowed hard. "Like it's messing with us, man." Scooby let out a low whine, his fur bristling as an ominous thud reverberated through the hall. At the end of the corridor, a large door appeared where there had been none before. Intricate carvings covered its surface, and the whispers fell silent. Fred inhaled sharply. "We need to see what's inside." Velma hesitated but gave a reluctant nod. "This house is playing a game with us, but we need to figure out why." Shaggy groaned, his voice trembling. Do we really have to?" Ignoring him, Fred stepped forward and pushed the heavy door open. It creaked ominously as they stepped inside. The room was a study, untouched by time. Dust motes hung in the air, illuminated by flickering candlelight. At the center of a polished desk sat a single object, a cassette recorder, identical to the one they had found earlier. But this one was pristine, as if it had just been placed there. Velma exhaled, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. Fred pressed play. The tape crackled to life. And then Velma's own voice. "If you're listening, we failed again." A chill ran down her spine as her recorded voice distorted, layering over itself in a whispering chorus. "The house resets every time we don't stop it. This isn't the first time, but this time, we have a chance." Fred's fists clenched. "Stop what?" The voice on the tape dropped to a whisper. "The Guardian. It's been watching you." Static cut off abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Shaggy's eyes darted around the room, his breathing uneven. "Watching?" Then they heard it. A single, deliberate footstep. Fred turned toward the doorway. A figure stood there, draped in shifting darkness, its face an unreadable void. It tilted its head, as if studying them. Then it stepped closer. Fred seized Daphne's arm. "Run!" They bolted, slamming the door shut behind them. The mansion reacted violently, its corridors twisting and shifting, trying to swallow them whole. "The Guardian is trapping us in a loop," Velma gasped, her mind racing. Shaggy's voice cracked. "How do we stop it?" Fred's jaw tightened. "We break the loop." Daphne's eyes widened. "But how?" Velma's gaze snapped toward the study. The recorder. It had the answer. Fred cursed under his breath, but nodded. "Then we go back." Scooby whimpered, "Row, row!" Shaggy went pale. "Go back toward it." Fred grabbed his arm. "We don't have a choice." Then the footsteps behind them started again. Faster. Closer. Fred led the charge, forcing their way through the shifting halls as the house resisted them. They reached the study. Velma lunged for the recorder, slamming the play button. The tape resumed. Velma's recorded voice was tight with urgency. "If you made it this far, find the portrait. Find him." A chill ran through Velma. "Find who?" Before the tape could answer, the Guardian arrived. Its shadow stretched across the floor, looming over them. Fred's grip on Velma tightened. "The portrait, now!" Her eyes darted across the walls, then she saw it. A massive painting hung above the fireplace. A figure stood in the frame, obscured by darkness, but one detail was unmistakable. A Great Dane. Scooby's ears flattened. "Ray!" Velma's breath hitched. "Scooby, it's you." The Guardian lunged. The world went black. The shadows stretched across the floor like ink seeping through the cracks, swallowing what little light remained in the room. The air thickened, weighed down by something unnatural. Fred clenched his jaw, stepping in front of the others, instinctively shielding them from the figure looming in the doorway. A low, guttural breath filled the silence, floorboards creaking under an unseen weight. Velma's voice barely rose above a whisper. "The portrait. It's Scooby." Daphne sucked in a sharp breath. "That doesn't make sense." Fred's gaze flickered between the Guardian and the massive painting above the fireplace. Half hidden in shadow, the figure within the portrait was unmistakable Great Dane, its old-fashioned collar glinting in the dim light. Scooby's tail drooped as he whimpered. "Raggy?" Shaggy swallowed hard. "I don't like this, man. I really don't like this." Velma adjusted her glasses, trying to steady her thoughts. "The Guardian, it's not just trapping us, it's guarding something." Fred stepped forward. "If it's guarding something, that means it can be defeated." Daphne shook her head. "But how?" Velma's eyes locked onto the painting again. "There's something about Scooby, about who he really is." Scooby looked around frantically. "Oh, Rhea." Then the Guardian moved. A sudden rush of air, deep, echoing footsteps. Fred barely had time to react before everything went dark. A cold wind tore through the room. The shadows surged forward, swallowing them whole. The wind howled. Walls groaned. Lights flickered wildly. Then, silence. Velma blinked. The study was gone. A long hallway stretched before her, lined with paintings of unfamiliar faces. The walls, pristine and untouched, glowed under a soft golden light. The scent of old books and aged wood filled the air, tinged with something metallic. She turned quickly. Fred? Daphne? Shaggy? No answer. Her breath quickened. She wasn't in the mansion anymore. She was in a memory. Faint echoes drifted through the corridor, distant murmurs as if people were speaking just out of reach. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar, a flickering light pulsing from within. With hesitant steps, she approached. Inside, a laboratory. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Scooby-Doo. But not as she knew him. This Scooby was younger, smaller, and he wasn't alone. A man stood beside him, scribbling notes on an old clipboard. His back was turned, his features obscured, but his voice low, steady, almost affectionate, sent chills through Velma's spine. "You're special, my friend. The key to everything." Scooby barked happily. Velma's pulse quickened. "What am I seeing?" She stepped forward, and suddenly, the man turned. His face, Velma gasped. "No." Then, darkness. A massive rushing heartbeat pounded like a deep drum in the void. Velma snapped back to reality. She was in the mansion again, on her knees, Fred shaking her shoulders. "Velma, what happened?" She gasped, still reeling. I saw something. Scooby was there, a long time ago, and there was a man." Shaggy helped Scooby up. "Ray?" Velma turned to look at Scooby. For the first time, he looked scared of himself. Fred narrowed his eyes. If Scooby was there, that means he's part of whatever this place is. Daphne shook her head. "But what does that mean?" Velma exhaled. "It means Scooby isn't just involved in this mystery." She turned to the massive portrait again. "Scooby is the mystery." The Guardian lurched forward, its growl reverberating through the walls. The air shifted, heavy and thick with unseen force. Fred grabbed Scooby. "We need to get out of here now." The shadows collapsed inward as the mansion began to shake. Wood split. Glass shattered. A deep rumble shook the ground beneath them. Shaggy gripped Velma's arm. "Whoop, where do we go?" Velma's mind raced. "We finish what was started." Fred turned toward the portrait. If Scooby is the key, then the answer is in him. The Guardian roared, lunging forward. The walls shattered. And then, everything turned to white. Silence fell, as if the entire world had been erased. Blinding white light consumed everything. The mansion, the walls, the floor gone. Silence followed, thick and absolute, as if time itself had stopped. Faint echoes faded into nothingness. Then, the whiteness fractured, shattering like glass. The group plunged into darkness. A rush of wind, bodies hitting the ground. Velma gasped, struggling to sit up. Fred groaned beside her. Daphne pressed her fingers to her temples, and Shaggy curled into a trembling ball. Scooby stood completely still. They were no longer in the mansion. Instead, they found themselves inside a vast metallic chamber. The air was cold, the walls pulsing with glowing symbols. At the center, a massive machine emitted a soft hum. Velma's pulse quickened. This place, it's real. Daphne shook her head. Where are we? Fred stepped forward, eyes locked on the machine's glowing core. This wasn't just a haunted house. Velma swallowed hard. It was never a house. It was a prison. The machine's hum deepened, its rhythmic pulses growing stronger. Shaggy shivered. Prison for what? Then, the realization hit Velma like a bolt of lightning. She turned to Scooby. His ears drooped, his tail hung low. Something deep in his memory, clawing its way to the surface. Fred's voice was calm but firm. Scooby, what do you remember? Scooby hesitated. Then, softly, I don't know. A deep mechanical whirring filled the chamber. Alarms began to activate. Velma's eyes darted to the symbols on the console. These aren't just random markings, they're commands. Daphne moved closer. Commands for what? Velma exhaled. For him. Silence. Fred's jaw clenched. You mean Scooby was part of this? Velma nodded. He was the key. Shaggy backed away. No way, man. Scooby's just a dog. Before anyone could respond, a robotic voice echoed through the chamber. System reset initiated. Alarms blared. Energy crackled through the air. Fred spun around. We need to get out of here. Velma shook her head. Number, if we leave now, we'll forget everything again. Fred's breath caught. This has happened before. Velma nodded. Every time. Shaggy's voice wavered. How do we stop it? Then, Scooby stepped forward. His paws were steady, his breathing calm, his gaze locked onto the machine. Velma whispered, Scooby? He turned to her, then to the console. I know what to do. The machine's hum intensified. Electricity surged through the air. Fred hesitated. Scooby? Scooby leaped, slamming his paw onto the core. A blinding explosion of light erupted. A deafening surge of energy. Then, darkness. Silence. Nothing. And then, the steady hum of an engine. Velma blinked. They were back. The road stretched ahead. No mansion. No fog. Daphne yawned. That was a long drive. Fred glanced at the GPS. Almost there. Shaggy stretched. Man, I feel like I had the weirdest dream. Scooby sat beside him, staring out the window. Velma's hands trembled as she checked her phone. No strange messages, no static, no whispers. Everything was normal. Then Scooby turned to her. For the briefest moment, she saw it. A flicker of recognition. Then, Scooby grinned. Roo-row, row. A faint whisper rode the wind. The mystery machine drove on. The town was gone. But the mystery was never over. The screen faded to black.